It is a joy to be here today, and I'm telling you, this little lady that just got introduced is the delight of our lives, and she's out of our 5 natural grandchildren, she is the only female. Now, for you who understand that concept, you understand that we've been trying to spoil her, but she refuses to get spoiled, but we're still at that. She is a junior, going into her junior year in high school in West Hartford, and just blowing the top out of her grades and all that sort of stuff. So we're so excited. You may have figured out by now that my wife decided that I needed to celebrate a special birthday. And so we've had some people over twice already, and then we've got another bunch. All the kids and their whatevers are coming this week, and so we're kind of exhausted, to say the least, and expect to be that way for some time. While I'm thinking about, Bob Starnes is going to be teaching for me next week. On Sunday, we're going to be taking a whole bunch of folks to the airport so they can make their way back to cooler climate. And then I asked Mark if he'd pull the next Sunday. I just felt like I just needed another week, because this week is going to be maddening, to say the least, with many people we're going to have in our household. So anyway, you'll understand why Bob and Mark are here for the next 2 weeks. I told somebody I'm just going to go sit and soak a little quietness. Things have been hectic around our house. Anyway, we are in a new book for our Sunday school. We are in the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, I won't embarrass you by asking you to raise hands before you picked up your quarterly. How long has it been since you read through the book of Ecclesiastes? I won't, because I'm pretty sure that most of us, that's not our favorite book. And in fact, if you feel like you need to follow in the scripture, and I hope you do, and you need to use the index, feel free to do that, because it's, you can find Psalms by kind of opening in the middle, but that particular book's a little harder to find. Beautiful book. What we're at this time, we're gonna, your scripture, if you read the quarterly, your scripture is actually part of chapter 1 and part of chapter 2. We're going to try to walk quickly through all of chapter 1 and then pick up some verses in chapter 2. It's an amazing book. Come on. It's an amazing book, and I read several commentaries, and the commentary that I use most frequently said, if you're starting Ecclesiastes, start at the back of the book and work your way from it. And I think you'll understand that if it's been a while since you read the book, you'll understand that. The conclusion of this book is chapter 12, verse 1. Don't let the excitement of youth cause you to forget your Creator. Now in your youth, before you grow old and life's not pleasant anymore. Now, we're in that latter stages, most of us, and we understand that there are little challenges, but fine. Verse 13 of chapter, this is the whole story. Here now is my final conclusion: fear God and obey his commandments, for this is everyone's duty. So when we get that concept that we're going to wind up positive, when we go through a little negative stuff at the beginning, then you'll understand that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Solomon writes Ecclesiastes, but he not only writes Ecclesiastes, he writes the Song of Songs, and he writes Proverbs. Now, most people most scholars tell me that Solomon, who is, by the way, King David's son, rules the nation for 40 years. At the beginning was a very godly man. And he writes, the first one of his books is the Song of Songs. And most people attribute that as a love story that Solomon probably penned. Other people don't think Solomon wrote all the books. I like the fact that he wrote these. I like that thought. Proverbs is written in his middle years. Proverbs is a book that I keep forgetting to go back to and start rereading every day. But Proverbs is a great book. It got wisdom beyond our capacity to absorb all of it. This needs to be read and reread and reread. And then the Ecclesiastes is one that he writes toward the end of his life. At least most people think that. The book seems to float between a life of stability and a life that seems, I don't know what's going on. It says, seen as a vapor. Well, if you know anything about walking out in a cold morning when you've been in a warm room, chances are you're going to blow a little vapor. That's exactly the picture where he talks about right here. The vapor, and that technical term means meaningless. We'll get to that in just a minute, or futile. Solomon is really not cynical of life, but you can read the book and get that he's very cynical about life. But when you read the whole book and go back and reread it, you'll find he's really not cynical. He has some sober assessments. I like the way that commentary said that. And then he says some other things. And in my opinion, he asks you to look at the book, at the writing, as an introspective book, to refer to yourself as one of introspection. And he says, I want you to think, he says this, that I want you to think deeply about the real questions of life. One question that I remember toying with when I was particularly in those college years, why am I here? And what's the purpose of my life? And what am I going to do with my life? And all of those kind of why and if and wherefores that we go through. I think he says, take a long look at why you're here. And then the second thing is, I think he wants you to be realistic about life in general. We sometimes start off with some lofty dreams, and we find out later that sometimes those dreams can't happen. And so we're caught in the middle after that. So we want to face reality. And then there's a question that sometimes we don't hit till later in life, but we should have hit younger in life. It's a question on mortality. One of these days, you're not going to be here. So what part of your life, what have you left as an impression for this period of time? Verses 1-6 of chapter 1, I put this in, it's added, not in your quarterly, but I felt like you couldn't get started on it without starting at chapter 1, verse 1. So just listen to Max as he says this.
The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets, and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north, round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea.
I don't know where. I think he said it. The word meaningless is actually, as we said before, it's a vapor. If you remember growing up like I did with the King James Version, you probably read it as vanity of vanities and that. And so it may ring a bell rather than meaningless, but it's used 4 times in just these first 2 verses. So Solomon is trying to get our attention early on, and then he uses the phrase under the sun. Now, under the sun simply means whatever happens on the earth. And so it's universal, but it's also specific. It's anything that's going, and I put the words anything observable. So I think that's probably a good approach to that. And then I want you to notice that there's some repetitiveness, and Solomon is famous for this. In fact, if you haven't read Solomon, you need to read it because you'll understand this circle that he talks about. You'll notice he says some things. Generations come and generations go. Well, what does that mean? My grandparents lived in a generation. That generation is no longer there. Their generation was taken over by my parents' generation, and their generation is taken over by me. But there is a cycle, meaning it starts and it goes and it starts all over again. And then he says something like, the sun rises and the sun sets. And now you and I both know that now the sun is the center of the universe for all practical purposes, for my layman's thought, and the earth rolled around it, but that's not what they thought at that time. They just thought that sun rolled around, and so we get the sunrise, sunset, and it's still, that's the way I normally think of it anyway. And that the way, when's the sun going to rise, when it's going to set, and all that sort of stuff. And then it says the wind blows. The wind blows. Sometimes it comes from the north, sometimes it comes from the south. You don't know. You remember the passage in John chapter 3, I think it is, where Nicodemus comes and talks to Jesus by night. And he said, you're a master of Israel, and yet you can't tell me where the wind comes from or where it goes. And he tries to incorporate that, and he's very beautiful talking about that. We get all of that, and then we continue that thought in verses 7 through 11.
Yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? It was here already long ago. It was here before our time. There is no remembrance of men of old, and even those who are yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow.
I read that several times this week, of course, in preparation, and the thing that popped into my mind was an old I'm just lost. Okay. You remember the play originally, Showboat, and then became a movie? You may not remember. There's lots of beautiful songs in that. It's kind of like The King and I and all those something. It was during that genre when well, Showboat had a line. It was actually an old spiritual base, and it really had a lot to do with slaves and non-slaves. So it goes back to that. But there's a little chorus in there that always fascinated me, and I want to read that to you. Again, this comes from Old Man River. Old Man River, that old man river, he don't do nothing, but he does know something. He just keeps rolling, keeps on rolling along. He don't plant taters, and he don't plant cotton. And them that plants them are soon forgotten. but old man river, he just keeps rolling along. And then the song ends, the latter verse says, I'd get weary and sick of trying. I'm tired of living, but I'm scared of dying. But old man river, he just keeps rolling along. Now, if you haven't watched that movie or seen that play, let me recommend it. It's gorgeous production. It's one of those kind of things. But when we get here, we're going to hear that thing. Whoop, 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 whoop. Oh, I already did that. Let's back up.
I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is twisted cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted.
Let me go back to the slide. I can't seem to get this to go backwards on me. In that first one, you remember we talked about the streams that go to flow downward till they hit the sea. And Solomon says that happens, but it doesn't seem like the sea ever changes, basically. And yet somehow or another, the water gets back up to where the springs that fed the river, and it keeps flowing down. And that's what happened most of the time. There are exceptions to that. And then he says, all things are wearisome. The eye has never enough seeing, nor the ears of hearing. I take that to mean that if you're open-minded enough, as you look around you, you see things and you hear things that just continue to amaze you. You think you know it all, and then suddenly you see something or hear something, and it's there. One says, is there anything new under the sun? Is there anything of which one can say it's done again, but there's nothing new under the sun? Well, when you read that slowly, you get the impression that it doesn't matter where we are today in our life. Everything we're gonna do is built upon something that already has been done. Let me use my math background again. If you don't learn how to add, subtract, and multiply, you're gonna struggle with long division. If you don't get long division, you're gonna have a trouble with fractions. Are you with me? Everything that we do is based upon something that we have done or has been there. In fact, if we were really to be honest, there's never a really new invention. It's all based upon pieces from other things. It's just meshed together in a different way. And it says, I think it says, there's no remembrance of the men of old, and even those yet to come will not be remembered forever. And we think about that and we say, you know, I knew my grandfather, I knew my grandmother, but I didn't know their parents. And after I'm gone, there'll be a time in which nobody remembers me. And Solomon is saying, realistically, we're here for a certain period of time. I think that's really what Brother Ed was trying to say when he said, why aren't you living today as though it means something? Aren't you doing something worthwhile? I think this one has already played or tried to play, so let me just read it to you. I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under heaven. What a heavy burden God has laid on men. I've seen all things that are done under the sun, and all of them are meaningless, are chasing after the wind. What's twisted cannot be straightened. What's lacking cannot be counted. Notice I put them in red, the eyes. Solomon is saying my observation, my. And then he said, I devoted myself to study. I've known people, because I've gone to college to get my degree and all that sort of thing. I've known people that I'd sit beside in class who didn't ever appear to study. You know people like that, that just seemed like it just came natural to them. In my case, it didn't come natural. I had to work at it. Now, Judy won't say that I worked at it, but I did have to work at it. But when he says that, I devoted myself, he says, I am going to put all of my resources. Now, Solomon was a king for 40 years. He had a little more freedom than you and I do. I mean, all of his needs are met, okay? And he says, I devoted myself, I set my heart and my mind. Maybe you have tried to learn to play guitar or a piano. And you understand that when the guy on the TV does all kind of stuff with his instrument, and you said, I'd like to do that, and you pick it up and all of a sudden it doesn't sound like what he did. I love it when we have the violinist that comes, because I have never in my life heard anyone play a violinist that made it sound so beautiful. Most of the time they could squeak a little. He said he's careful and meticulous. I'm convinced that if we want to become excellent at anything, gardening, painting, anything, that it takes some effort and some mental work to get it together. You got to learn how it forms. I see Master Gardener back there, and one that's not here, and I know when I put something in the ground, I just expect it to grow. I don't have any idea of what kind of soil conditions and whether or not it needs to be in the sunshine or the shade. I just looking in the ground, and sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't. It's that kind of thing. And then he's going to say some other things. He said, I wanted to study and explore all that is done under heaven. Now, I learned when I finished graduate school, my degree was in math, and I had the opportunity to go to college to get my doctorate degree. From what I learned in my master's degree, I had to make a decision. Do I want to have a life outside of the book work, or do I want to do the book work and get the fancy degree it goes on the end? I knew I had to so immerse myself with that study to obtain that degree that a lot of other things had to go. And he's saying, I want to make sure that I, with the wisdom God has given me, I want to apply that knowledge and make it useful. And then he said something that's a little strange. I put a star by it because it says, what a heavy burden God has laid on them. Whatever. The New Living says what a tragic existence life is. And the New American Standard said what is a grievous task. But perhaps the best translation is the Amplified, where it says what a heavy burden with which to busy themselves. They got to get going and got to do all that. And he's saying, what's going on with it? Is life worth the pain that has to live in. And I think what he's saying at the end, he's saying, yes, God gave us the privilege of work because it's good for us. There's a value in good work. There's a value in cleaning the kitchen. There's particularly value in cleaning the restrooms. There's a value in making your room, your house look straight. There's a value in that. And then it says there's a trial. And sometimes there's a stain on the cabinet or a stain on the floor. It's work to get it off. You understand? And he's saying, God has put us here, and we can either look at the value of it or look at the trial of it. And we've got that. And yet Solomon says it's all meanings. It's like chasing the wind. This is John Watson. Solomon seems to say, the more knowledge that I have, the more knowledge is out there for me to learn. I'm never going to master it all. Now, for you who've been married or are married or all that sort of stuff, you ought to figure out what your mate thinks about second or third year. But in my 50 some odd years, I've learned that I get surprised pretty regularly. And we can't quite get it all together in pat little answers. Life is not made that way. The more we learn, the more there is to learn. He says, what's twisted and what is lacking, I pull that two verses together, can't be straightened or counted. I think it means you can only count what's in your basket. You count something that's not in your basket. If you go to get eggs from the hen house, you only count the ones that actually got, not the ones that you wish you had gotten. Our one's resource, in my opinion, will never be enough to get all done that we need to. So we need a higher power. We need God to work through us to do what he wants us to do. So I said, just trust God. Ecclesiastes 1:16 through 18.
I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I have experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief.
I read this, and sometimes in the latter part of the week, I outlined those I's. Notice again, the personal. This to me, I'm pretty important, and you need to pay attention to what I'm saying because I got some stuff to say. I. And I said to myself, my East Texas vernacular, this dude is full of himself. Now, the fact that he's King Solomon, but this dude thinks he's got it all together because he says, I have more wisdom. Now, back up just a minute. You remember when David passes and Solomon is anointed king, God asked him, what do you want? And he said, I can give you money, I can give you nations, I can give you all kinds of stuff. And Solomon responds, I want a heart to lead my people. John Watson terminology. Solomon at that point in his life was speaking with deep reverence of his own inadequacy to do something. kind of grew out of that by the time he gets to here. He said, I'm smarter than anybody else in the classroom. You take your classroom and go to somebody else's classroom, I'm still smarter than they are. I'm smarter than any king that has been here before, and I'll be smarter than anybody that comes after me. I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom. I wanted to take my wisdom and apply it to every grouping of activities under the sun. And he says, I wanted to know what madness was and folly was. And I learned that this is chasing after the wind, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow, much knowledge comes grief. Note the emphatic I. And he says, my thoughts have grown in wisdom and experience and knowledge. And then he says, again, a verse that I put stars by like I did the first one. Because if you just take that out of context, you don't quite grab a hold of it. The verse says, with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge we get, the more grief. So I put myself back in those days of administration. And I began to start realizing that as I moved up the ladder in my profession, as I moved up the ladder, not only did you get a bigger paycheck, but there was also more responsibility. There came a point in which I saw some people that were hit the next level, and then they gave it up and went back a step or two because they didn't want to take home the responsibility. When you're the boss or the guy in charge of the project, you worry about what's going to happen next. And so you spend a lot of time away from the job doing the job. You understand? I see Bobby. Yeah, she was a teacher, and you just don't walk in the classroom and start teaching. You have to spend a lot of time preparing. It's a whole lot harder than it looks. When you're an administrator, you got to do some things. You got to think through some things, got to think deeply about some things. And he says, sometimes the more responsible you have, the more bigger your headache, more sorrow. And then he says, the more knowledge one gets, the more grief. Begin to start realizing that your decision affects not only you, but affects some other people. And so begin to realize the power of that. Chapter 2 is going to say that Solomon did a lot of things to try to figure out this world. And he says, I decided to follow pleasure and laughter. In other words, whatever made somebody laugh, I wanted to do it better. I wanted to crack better jokes. I wanted to do whatever the gangs were doing that seemed to be making happy and happy. And he said, I even followed wine and folly. And then an amazing phrase in that. It says, in all of it, I was guided by wisdom. Well, you and I know of a bunch of people that started down the road of alcoholism, and there wasn't any wisdom associated with it. But Solomon said, I followed that deeply into alcoholism and folly, being silly, doing dumb things. I followed that, but I had an ability to step aside and look at it. I built great projects. Solomon is known as the greatest builder of all times, perhaps. He built massive gardens. He had massive stables. He did irrigation. He did all kinds of fruit trees. He did all the masterful things. He said, I wanted to tackle a project just so I could prove that I could do it. But when he got through, there was another project to be done. And he was there. And he said, I did houses and vineyards and gardens and from that. And then he said, I turned my eyes to sexual indulgence. 700 wives, 300 concubines. I decided I wanted to experiment with that area of life, and he said, this ain't worth it all. And he comes down to the end of that section and he says that wisdom, in compared to folly, that wisdom will win over it hands down. That you're better to be wise than foolish. And then he says, just to give you an example, he said, not only is wisdom better than folly, it's that light is better than darkness. You know, when you get into the deep, weird stuff that goes on in some of our country and some of our activities, and it's almost always done in darkness. But he said, you keep yourself in the light, it's better for you. And then he says, right at the end, think about the end of life. Whether you've been dumb all your life and done nothing but foolish things, or you've been wise all your life and done wise things, at some point, you're going to stop living. You're going to die. Well, again, we think this is verses 17 through 21 of chapter 2.
So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me, and who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool. Yet he will have control over all the work into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then he must leave all he owns to someone who has not worked for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune.
I read and reread this passage, and I finally said, I think the reality of life suddenly caught Solomon up short. Like it happens to us from time to time. I think the reality of life does that. And I think what he does right here, he has a pity party. Now, if you haven't had a pity party like this, everything I done is worthless, everything I can't get ahead, can't make anybody happy, I can't. When you read that from that pity party thing and you say, have I ever done that? And I'd say, yes, I have. Yeah. If you haven't had one of those lately, you just wait, you might get one later. He says you got all this stuff going on around you and you can't control it. And I think involved in that, though, is the reality that work, although it's not always easy, it's not always enjoyable, but work was created by God as a good thing. It says God created all of that before sin came into the world. So Solomon asked himself some questions that we senior adults ask ourselves. And we ask ourselves, is anybody coming after us that have the same values I do? Is there anybody coming after us that are conservative in spending like I am? Or are any of us, if I were to drop a ton of money in somebody's lap, would they blow it before 2 years are out, or would they be wise with it and save a little for their grandkids? Are you with me? We come to that point where you ask, is anything, do they have the same values that I do? I'm not going to go there. Then I was reminded of the story of the prodigal son. And I think all of us have known families that have a prodigal. They went away and they spent all their inheritance. And we realized what happened. He wound up in pig pens. All of us have lost that through laziness or foolishness of lifestyle. But in reality, the same is true in the spiritual sense. When we watch our parents or our grandparents, and I didn't see my grandparent very much to live with them all the time, but I saw enough of their after effects and how they affected their kids. I understand what grandparents were trying to relate. And what's happened to our inheritance? What have we done with what they passed on to do, and what will happen later? For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then he must leave it to someone else who hadn't worked for it. And this is frustration. The challenge in this powerful verse is twofold as I take it. Number one, are we using all the gifts God gave us? Are we making use of the hours that God has granted us? And so have we incorporated into our life compassion and care for other people? Is that part of us? Is that something that you mastered over the year, or at least working on? The inheritance we leave in reality is not how much stuff we leave, but it's a character that we are. And it's expressed in how much God values us and values other people. When we look around the world and we see life taken so haphazardly, and we realize that God created all of us, and we wonder, have you never thought about the value of life itself? Why are you randomly killing people in Walmart or in a movie theater? Why are you doing it? Don't you understand that your life had a purpose, real life? When you verses 22 and 23.
What does a man get for all the toil and anxious striving with which he labors under the sun? All his days, his work is pain and grief. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless.
Even at night, his mind's not rest. And I put this, if our work is so draining that we don't have time for anything else, then we're putting too much effort in work. If we can't find the time, and I have to force myself, if I'm going to slow down, I just have to get a book and go sit down and read and tune everything out. I have to find, no, you might find that differently. You may find gardening is your mental relaxation. I don't know what it is, but I think we need to realize that if you work, your efforts in raising or whatever is taking too much of us, we need. So we need to give ourselves permission to be still, and with lives too full, we often empty ourselves and there's nothing left. And it's an easy thing to get trapped into. Verse 24 and 25.
A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too, I see, is from the hand of God, for without him, who can eat or find enjoyment?
One of the verses you need to copy in, or two verses, put it on your mirror. It's okay to be happy. It's okay to eat something that the doctor says don't eat, just occasionally. It's okay. It's okay. Just to give you a little breathing room. It's okay. Life is wasted if one lives without God. Work finds value when we are grateful. Notice it says, from the hand of God, we are grateful. Be thankful and share God's goodness. Last verse.
To the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind.
This verse is challenging because we can't see this happening. We can't see evil people giving the goods to good people. But I'm telling you that it's actually true, and we don't see it. God looks after the righteous and seems to allow sometimes the wicked. I remember somehow people that weren't particularly religious would give me a helping hand. You know, they'd come over and cut a tree. They'd do something. Sometimes those kind of things just happen. Proverbs 13:22 says, good people leave their inheritance to the grandchildren, but a sinner's wealth passes to the godly. We don't understand that. I'm just proving you what. So a couple of passages that I found from the New Testament, I think Luke 12 says, beware and be on guard, this is Jesus speaking, against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does life consist of his provision. And John 10:10, Jesus said, I came to give life that they may have it abundantly. So our conclusions, temporal things will not produce eternal value. Our search for significance must be rooted in God. To be truly happy, we must focus on the Creator rather than the creation. Well, maybe you got